And so notice that for Spengler, the great creative period of mathematics lies in the 3 centuries between Pythagoras and Euclid and Archimedes, and that period also, it's not a coincidence that that period is also the period of the achievements of the greatest of the artworks that are achieved in that period. This is the period of the building of the great temples on the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and this is also the period of the great sculptors, Phidias and Praxiteles, Polygnotus, Lysippus, in which the great art, the Greek art form that best exemplified their understanding of being was indeed sculpture. Nobody ever did it any better than the Greeks did. And I've seen their sculptures. I saw an exposition of Greek sculpture at in the National Gallery in Washington, and it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. Nobody did it better than them. And they did it during this period, at the same period, from Pythagoras to Euclid and Archimedes, who correspond to roughly the finishing up of philosophy also with Plato and Aristotle, and the finishing up of sculpture with Lysippus before it declines into Hellenistic sculpture. It's well known that Hellenistic sculpture isn't as great as the sculpture of the 5th and 4th centuries BC in Athens. It's not even comparable, not even close. And the mathematics declines during that period, philosophy declines during that period. That's all the civilization megalopolitan period that comes after 300 BC. Same thing for us, for Western civilization. The one who corresponds to Pythagoras, in our case, is Descartes, who appears and is the first to begin to realize a specifically non-classical mathematics with his analytic geometry and the creation of the Cartesian phase space, in which Descartes is sort of realizing the Renaissance idea of depth perspective, which was also completely alien to the classical sensibility, and it's the idea of the infinite space. Our Western civilization, what Spengler calls Faustian civilization's understanding of being, is the exact opposite of the classical. It's precisely infinite space and the passionate thrust into this third dimension of infinite space. So we already see it coming into being there with Descartes and in the generation of Pascal and Fermat in the 17th century, and then it gets finished up and worked out right about 1800 there by Gauss and Cauchy and Riemann. Riemann invents non-Euclidean geometry at about the same time, Spengler says, as classical music, which corresponds in our civilization to Greek sculpture as the great metaphysical art par excellence that best realizes our understanding of being as infinite space. And it's in precisely, our mathematics is finished up in its great creative period in precisely the same period in which classical music finishes up with Bach and Gluck and Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, right in that period there as we shift into classical civilization. So in allying and showing that mathematics in its great creative period happens at the same time as the arts, he's basically saying that the mathematician is a kind of artist and belongs to the culture period, not the civilization period, in which metaphysics is the great picture language that gets worked out during that period, and it's motivated by this, what he calls this dread, this world fear that seeks to capture becoming in a become picture, a frozen solid world picture of the world as nature, which is opposed to the idea of world as history. In world as history, we have the idea of time, things living and evolving and developing and growing through time, especially time insofar as it has a direction that is absolutely irreversible, whereas, and that's the world as history, the world as things growing, unfolding, civilizations realizing themselves, life cycles realizing themselves, which is opposed to the world as nature, which is the world of things extended in space, subject to the law of causality. Whereas with time, the world as history, things are bound to the destiny idea. Destiny as things which unfold through time. So destiny versus causality, world as history, world as nature, and mathematics has to do with the world as nature, with the creation of a cosmology. And it's fundamentally religious. It's motivated, which is another surprising idea about mathematics. The way Spengler presents it is that it's fundamentally motivated out of a religious sensibility. And Pythagoras obviously was the founder of a great religion, as well as the mathematics. And Descartes and Leibniz were also both religious. Plato has essentially religious sensibilities. So that mathematics is motivated out of a religious sensibility because the mathematicians and the philosophers are doing the same thing that the artists of their respective epochs are doing in that 300-year window, that period of high culture in which culture flowers and comes to its apogee is realizing the great achievements of the civilization, and everything that comes after that is but a pale echo. And so that's the culture period. He says in between these two, there's another mathematics. This is the Arabian mathematics, or what he calls the mathematics of the Magian civilization. He says by the time we get to Diophantus, Diophantus was a 2nd century, or right about 200 AD. He lived in Alexandria. Alexandria was a cosmopolis, although he says that by this time Alexandria was actually, by 200 AD, it was actually devolving from the level of a world cosmopolis to a mere collection of houses with a completely different alien population that was living there than what had been there during its great cosmopolitan period. And Diophantus is the first classical mathematician in whom we begin to see an essentially non-classical mathematic. That is to say that Diophantus is normally regarded as the father of algebra. And in algebra we have the non-specified numerical quantity, the x, the y, the z, which is a type of mathematics that is inherently alien to the classical sensibility, in which everything is clear, measurable, and very perceptible to the senses. There is no non-measurable mathematics, nothing that isn't immediately and intuitively grasped by the senses in Euclidean geometry. But here with Diophantus, Diophantus is living in the 2nd century AD. During the period, this is normally called the late classical civilization, but Spengler will say that this is a misnomer. What we have going on here is the emergence of a new civilization, the Judeo-Christian Islamic Magian civilization, which comes into being right around the year 0, and which begins, it's a little confusing to recognize, Spengler says, because it first expresses itself through the alien form language of classical aesthetics and architecture and classical rules that govern the formation of culture forms. He calls this, later he'll call this a pseudomorphosis. That is to say that a brand new culture has trouble sometimes expressing its own unique sense of being when the previous culture lies so heavily over the land that it has to express itself through the prior and now dead form language of the previous civilization. Consequently, he says that the Pantheon, which is built in the 2nd century AD, is basically the first mosque. The idea of the cupola, the dome-shaped building, is completely alien to the classical sensibility, in which everything is, there is no cavern idea with the Doric temple. And likewise, statues at this time, for the first time, have pupils with holes drilled right into the eye sockets, whereas all the eyeballs on classical sculpture were solid, because now we have the idea of a penetration of the soul by the spirit. The spirit is coming down and penetrating the soul, which receives it now, which is a new idea. It wasn't in the Greek civilization. It's a new idea that's consistent with this Magian civilization that Spengler's talking about. And so Diophantus, introducing a new mathematic here, corresponds more or less to Pythagoras. He's not a late phenomenon. He says there's something still uncertain and archaic and primitive about the Diophantine equations. They're not yet, they don't yet have a sense of self-assuredness that the later Arabian philosophers like Al-Khwarizmi will have, that finish up the Magian mathematics that begins right during this period here. This is the same time as new art forms are coming into being, what Spengler calls the new archaic art forms, like the Christian sarcophagus reliefs, which are awkward and look to our eyes very clumsy, but they're clumsy because they are expressing a new understanding of being, a new world spirit that is just now beginning to come in and is still uncertain about its form language. And this is also the period of the earliest mosaic, the art of the mosaic that will later be taken up by the Byzantines. And he says that the Byzantines are also part of this Magian civilization. The Plotinus, who is the philosopher of this time, corresponds to Duns Scotus in our civilization. He's an early philosopher, not a late classical one, and so forth and so on. So this is the mathematical sensibility, algebra, that is the contribution and creation of the realization of the Magian understanding of being, which their understanding of being, their cosmology now is the vision of a cavern. The world is a giant cavern, but the understanding of being is a wrestle between forces of light and darkness, the spirit and the soul, that are wrestling for dominion over the world stage, and that is the classical understanding of being. So we have a number of magical substances, and those magical substances, of course, translated into the form language of Arabian mathematics or Magian mathematics, is the mysterious properties, x, y, z, And the science, Spengler will later say, that is developed is the science of alchemy that comes out of the Magian civilization, which is distinct from the science of statics, of the classical mathematics, Euclidean geometry and statics, and also distinct from Faustian or Western science, which is based on dynamics. And the Western mathematic, the main mathematical contribution is coordinates, and the infinitesimal calculus, the Greeks absolutely abhorred the idea of anything suggestive of infinity. Spengler says this is also what lay behind their rejection of the heliocentric cosmology, which was indeed proposed by an Alexandrian astronomer, Aristarchus of Samos, who first proposed a Greek version of the heliocentric cosmology, but it was rejected by the Greeks. So once again, we have proof that this is not an evolutionary matter of a making of discoveries. It's a matter of a particular society's understanding of being that excludes anything that's inconsistent with that understanding of being. And so this is why the Greeks chose not to naturally select, as it were, Aristarchus's cosmology. It wasn't until Copernicus found it, and Copernicus was in a culture that already had a predisposition toward infinity and infinite space, that it began to make sense. And he says that the original understanding in Aristarchus of the heliocentric cosmology was still bounded, the cosmos was still bounded by a classical hollow sphere, a shell that sealed off, that still sealed off a sense of boundlessness, but nonetheless it was still rejected by the classical understanding of being. So we have three civilizations here with three completely different mathematics. Each one goes through its own cycle of elaboration and completion. Our Western mathematics completes itself at the same time as our classical music, and at the same time, right about the turn of the 19th century, 1800, right about the same time as we are shifting from the culture phase to the civilization phase, in which mathematics and philosophy and the arts they're still practiced, but they're no longer healthy. Because they're no longer necessary, they're no longer realizing, they're no longer actualizing from the possible to the actual culture's understanding of being. That has already been done. This is why culture is the becoming and civilization is the become. It is that which has been achieved and which a civilization has realized. It's already attained its goal. And so the practices of the mathematicians and philosophers and artists within the civilization phase are largely superfluous because they're simply contributing to a world picture that has already been realized. And so this is why he sees cultures declining when they attain this civilization phase. And so that's basically the sense of this chapter on the meaning of numbers. I think it's a very interesting one, and I like its idea that the mathematician is actually a metaphysician and an artist who is realizing a particular cultural understanding of being. He also points out that, for example, another thing that the classical mathematics did not discover deliberately was the number 0, in addition to negative numbers, but the number 0 was a contribution of the Hindu mentality, and of course that is consistent with a society in which the void, as discovered in Buddhism, is already there in full existence. So that's yet another example of a mathematic that comes out of a cultural worldview that expresses a unique and bounded worldview of a specific understanding of being in a specific civilization. So there we have it.